To thank you for watching Law School Made Easy at Law School Made Easy 256. Unlike our previous videos, today we are going to move step by step, process by process, such that we can appreciate the history of thought. And in this video, we are only going to look at two societies, and that is the Gentile society and the slave society. And we shall name it History of Thought, Episode 1. Then in our Episode 2, we shall discuss the feudalism and the mercantilism, and that will be our Episode 2. And then in Episode 3, which will be the final, we shall discuss the international trade, we discuss the enclosure movement, and also the industrial capitalism, that we shall name it the History of Thought, Episode 3. So we urge you to follow all the episodes that are going to come out for the History of Thought. Now, before we drill into the history, the societies, the Gentile and the slave, which we are having in this video, let us first appreciate the development of thought. Thought has developed basing on the development of man. As man developed, even the thoughts started to develop. So it is very important as we look at all these societies, the number one thing we must first look out for is the way of life. How were people in this society living? Now, when you appreciate how the people were living, then how were they sustaining their life? You also appreciate how they were sustaining their life. After appreciating how they sustained their life, it is at this point now you appreciate some of the skills, or some of the development, or some of the tools which were developed as a way of sustaining their life as they were growing in every society. If you come to the slave society, the feudalism, first find out the way of life. That is why, if you read, for us just to be able to appreciate the history, if you read the feudalism and you read about its way of life, immediately after it they tell you the development of law, meaning that the development of law is now secondary. The first thing is for you to appreciate how were they living before you tackle the area of development of the law. So first tell the examiner that the people in Gentile lived like this, in slave lived like this, and then you bring the aspect of development of law. How did the law develop from all those stages? But one thing you should note, in the first stage, that as man developed, even the thought developed. So we are, as a result of man and thought developing, they have developed simultaneous. As man grew, even the thoughts were developing. That is how the thought has developed, and that is the angle we can decide to appreciate the law of thought from. Now, let us now enter into what we call the Gentile society. In the Gentile society, this was a society based on clan. It was a clan-based society that we lived under clans. It was strictly under the clans. And number two, because we had no skills, because we are ancient, we have no skills, our means of production was collective. We would do collective production. We would work as a unit. I think for us to be able to appreciate, I'll give an example. If you remember the olden history, they would tell us that the elders would gather around the fire, everything was done communally, people would live together, solve problems communally because there was no law, all those things. This is what we mean in Gentile society, that the people were classless. They didn't have these things of class. You were capitalist, socialist, you are this, I'm this. No, they were ruled basing on clan basis. Now, as they continue to live as a communal, as a collective society, there was means of production developing. Certain skills, slowly by slowly, under stages, started to evolve. And one of them was the savagery. the stage of savagery as a means of production. They started to develop. And one thing we must note and appreciate in terms of savagery is that savagery was in two stages only: the middle stage of savagery and the upper stage of savagery. And in the middle stage of savagery, what was introduced is what we call the fire, club, and spear. That the fire, now we are talking about people who have been living their life together. If they want to get food, they go and collect mangoes as a team, oranges, they go and do everything communally as a group. But now, with the time, they begin to develop certain things, equipments, instruments, weapons. They begin to develop things to aid them, to help them to sustain their life. So there was development of the fire in the middle stage, club and spear. Then in the upper stage, but not by introduction of spear and the rest, then hunting became very easy. That you would go and hunt, and then you come back and you roast. You hunt, you roast, you run, you hunt, you cook. You see now, there is development of new activities which are not known to have been there in the Gentile society. But under the savagery, then these things are evolving. Then in the upper stage of savagery, there is the introduction of the bow and arrow out of polished stones, that they would use the polished stones to form the bows and the arrow. Now you can see we have now witnessed one advancement. We are advancing from the spear to the bow and arrow. And in this upper stage of savagery, what is introduced is what we call hunting. They begin serious hunting. Initially, in the middle stage of savagery, the first stage, they were using spears. But now they have advanced to bow and arrow. Something portable, you catch and you run after an animal. You run, you pull and shoot, pull and shoot, pull and hit, pull and hit. You are running after an animal. You see, now, people can now appreciate. You see now that in the Gentile, we are now developing new skills. We are advancing from this to this. Now, after the stage of savagery, they are developed another stage of production which is called the barbarism. And barbarism was in three stages: the lower stage of barbarism, the middle stage of barbarism, and the upper stage of barbarism. And in each of these stages, there were activities, there were skills, there were weapons, instruments that kept on developing. Now, in the lower stage of barbarism, there was weaving and pottery and domestication of animal and agriculture. You now see that weaving is being introduced, pottery is introduced, and the domestication of animals and the agriculture. Remember that in hunting, probably they were hunting to eat. They look and hunt and slaughter and eat. But now they have introduced domestication of animals. They are even started to keep some animals. And when you watch episode 2 of this, of History of TORT, you see, I think in the either enclosure movement, where there was the exportation of wool, the dealing of wool. When now in the mercantile, they started to deal in wool, and then they occupied a certain area that saw the serfs being displaced and ending slavery and capitalism developing. But that would be when we reach the mercantilism. But now you see, there is domestication of animals is being introduced. They are now keeping some animals at home because of the introduction of the weaving and pottery and others. Now, in the middle stage of barbarism, there was the introduction of the bronze tools. And when the bronze tools were introduced, immediately we got what we call the division of labor. People now started to divide labor. You can do this, you can do this. I think now you can apportion responsibility. And when we reach things like mercantilism, industrial, feudalism, you would know where division of labor came from. It began in the Gentile society. They are now introducing, you do this, me I will do this one will do this, the other one will do this. Now, finally, we go into what we call the stage of, the upper stage of barbarism. In the upper stage of barbarism, there was the introduction of iron smelting. And when iron smelting was introduced, immediately large-scale agriculture is now put into place. We now have large-scale agriculture introduced because of iron smelting. Now you see, people have started to grow. They are now growing from the savagery. They have now introduced hunting, some bit of agriculture, and now large-scale agriculture with the introduction in the upper stage of barbarism, introduction of iron smelting. Agriculture is introduced. And finally, the final stage in the Gentile is the civilization stage, which actually takes us into the slave society. Now, but before we go there, in the Gentile society, these people operated and lived on terms of kingship ties. Kingship ties. That they lived on the basis of relation. They have relations. You're my brother, my colleague. That type of relationship is how they lived. Number two, they lived on taboos as their social regulation. That they were governed in terms of social regulations by these taboos. If you do this, you get this. If you do this, you get this. That is how they lived. You remember here in Uganda, at a certain time, they would come and say that a woman is not supposed to eat grasshoppers. A woman doesn't eat chicken. A man doesn't do this. Those are some of the taboos. That is how they governed themselves. That is how they brought sanity in their society. And then from there, there were no laws governing them, simply because they had the state to enforce those laws. So they lived, even their political system was collective because there were no laws governing them. And it is very important to note, like I earlier stated, that the torts which are inexistent today were not there in the Gentile society. But you can see there is a good foundation which is laid. There is a good foundation which is laid for the development of TORT. I'll give an example. If you introduce agriculture, when we go to slave, you see that the now peasants have started to be used. They are being used as slaves to do agriculture. You see that we are creating problems. We are now escalating. There are challenges which are now beginning to come by the things which were introduced in the Gentile society. We want to thank you on that note. That is the Gentile society. It now takes us straight to what we call the slave society. And in the slave society, a few things we must note. We are going to deal with the introductions. Now, in the slave society, we are introduced. Of course, we last talked about civilization. Now, there is civilization and there is emergence of the philosophers in this society, which philosophers had a lot of time. They had a lot of time. They were thinkers. They were thinking on how to exploit the majority people. They actually became the instruments of coercion. But because for them they were thinkers, they were developing ideologies, they did not to participate. They did not want to participate in direct oppression. So what they did as the state was to introduce was to introduce the philosophers introduced the state. The state to act as an instrument of coercion. The state to implement the will of the minority over the majority slaves. Let me go slow on this. The philosophers who were thinking and writing hard introduced the state. When the state was introduced, it is this state that acted as the instrument of coercion on the peasants, on the slaves, and started to implement the will of the majority, of the minority over the majority. As if that was not enough, there was something which was introduced, the doctrine of false consciousness. The philosophers, through the state and themselves, introduced the doctrine of false consciousness, the sense of false consciousness. That this is how they were able to rule and control the peasants, by lying to them, making them believe certain things which were not true. Then in this very stage, there was the introduction of the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Empire as the state also began to develop. And they used the slave to supply, to work for them and develop the society. So, as time went on in this, with massive exploitation of the slaves got tired. And this became short-lived because there was development of trade, because the development of the Roman Empire, because the towns, because the slaves were doing a very good job in terms of development. But because of the few number of men, the number of slaves started to drop. Remember, many were being killed in those slavery work. So it started to decline slowly by slowly. The people, the number of men declined, and therefore there was shortage of the slaves. And this now affected the Roman Empire, which had relied on the works of the slaves. Now, by affecting them, it meant that the slaves were now dying out. And by this, some of the slaves were freed, and they traveled and moved and occupied other areas, which areas became to be known as colony. They occupied new areas where they stayed, and this area were now formed as colony, leaving the Roman Empire with the minority, leaving them with nothing to do, simply because now the means of production have scattered, and therefore the empire had to crumble. And also we see at minimal bit the introduction of the church as the largest land owner. The church also was introduced in this very stage. But by the scattering and forming of the colony, this is what made the slave society to collapse, because the slaves could no longer supply the minority. Now, and when this stage collapsed, it now went and developed into what you call the feudal society. And the downfall of the slave society led to the growth of the feudal society. So we want to thank you so much for watching Law School Made Easy at Law School Made Easy 256. We are going to have another episode, which is History of TORT episode 2, for you to follow. Now we shall do the feudalism and the mercantilism. We thank you so much for watching Law School Made Easy at Law School Made Easy 256. Subscribe, share, like our videos. Thank you.